Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to another Friday Reads weekly reading update with me, your host, Glenn, here at Glenn's Bookshelf. And I had a pretty satisfying reading week. I finished 3 books this week, which is pretty unusual for me. None of them were long books. One book I've been reading all month, and I talked about it in an earlier video, and that is this book here, The Last Picture Show by Larry McMurtry. I don't know if it was intended to be a standalone book. It probably was, but after McMurtry wrote this book, about 2 decades later, he wrote a sequel and then wrote a third book. So this became a series. It became at least a trilogy of books based in the fictional town of Thalia, although there is an actual Thalia in Texas. But I believe it's supposed to be based on where McMurtry grew up, which was Archer City. Anyway, I've been reading a chapter or two a day in this book, and I think there were 28 chapters. And then kind of towards the end, I read like the last 4 or 5 chapters in one sitting. And it's mainly concerned with 3 main characters. The main character, I think the book is mostly told from the point of view of a boy named Sonny. But there is also his best friend, Dwayne, and a girl named JC, who was originally Dwayne's girlfriend. And so the story kind of focuses on those 3 characters in this fictional town of Thalia in the early 1950s. McMurtry wrote this in 1966, and then about 20 years later, he wrote a sequel called Texasville, which I also have. I just bought it this week. Actually, I did another book haul run and got a obscene number of books, which I'm not going to talk about at this moment. But one of them was Texasville, and another one was the third book in this trilogy called Dwayne's Depressed, and that picks up one of the characters, Dwayne. And anyway, so I read this book. This was my first Larry McMurtry book. Read this as part of the Lone Star Book Club, which is hosted by Randy Ray at the Literate Texan. That was my first month participating in that book event. So so I enjoyed that, and I was happy to finish the book this week, and it was satisfying enough book that it caused me to go out and get the next 2 books in the series. Another book is a little piece of genre fiction here. This is Patricia Cornwell's The Body Farm. I think looks like this was maybe her 5th book. It was written in the early 1990s. And I know I had this book before and must have unhauled it. And so on one of my book haul runs, I picked it up again, just feeling in the mood this summer for some more of this reading. So this was a good story. She's a very good story writer, I think. The ending was, I guess I would call it dramatic, but maybe a little unsatisfying. Like I would have liked to have had more of an opportunity or seen more of the book sort of unpacking the life and crimes of the criminal, of the bad person. But read this over the course of a few days and picked up a few more of her books in the last couple book runs, and so I'm sure I'll probably read a couple more this summer, and then I might unhaul them and repeat the whole cycle again. But anyway, this was The Body Farm by Patricia Cornwell. The other book I completed was James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. This was Baldwin's first novel, and it, from what I read online, it is or was supposed to be at least semi-autobiographical. And the story centers around the Grimes family, which is a mother and father and their 4 children who live in Harlem. Their children, the 2 older children, the oldest is named John, and he is the character from whom the beginning and the end of the book are told from. It's John's perspective. In this book, he has just turned 14, and most of the events take place on a Saturday. And his father is a pretty strict religious person who, in the interest of disciplining his children, is pretty tough and violent. And in the first part of the book, we get an introduction, more or less, of about 60 pages told from John's point of view that culminates in an event in the household that results in a conflict and a crisis between the family members, and in particular the 3 adult members of this family and extended family. His father's name is, boy, now that I'm here on the video, I'm not remembering what his father's name. His father's name was Gabriel, a very apt religious name. His mother is Elizabeth, and Gabriel's sister Florence, John's aunt, is the other adult who comes to play a part in this book. And the stories of Florence, Gabriel, and Elizabeth are the center of the book, at least structurally, and the center of the book gives each of those characters, or provides a background for each of those characters and how they came to be where they are on that day. And a very fascinating story, really fascinating set of stories told from the point of view of each of these 3 characters, all of whom have come from the South. So they didn't grow up in the North, so they came up north as adults. And talks about each of the stories captures some of their growing up in the South and then the new life they experienced in the North in New York. Gabriel in particular is a former alcoholic, wild teen, young adult who, when he lived down south with his mother and his older sister Florence, he was not at all taking after his mother's religion, and he was going to prostitutes and hanging out with the wrong crowd and that sort of thing. He eventually has a conversion experience, a Christian conversion experience, and becomes a preacher down in the South. When we meet him up north in Harlem, he is a deacon in that church. So, and then the story ends again from John's point of view. And since the book is was written with kind of the idea of it being a semi-autobiographical story or background of the life of James Baldwin, I actually found the center 3 stories of the book the most riveting and really just incredibly well written. And particularly, and each of those stories contains a Baldwin's language, his immersion, his upbringing must have been of a very religious kind, and so his writing reflects that, and he gives to each of the adults in the story, I think, a really rich background story, and his weaving of the Christian life and values and doctrines and beliefs and practices of each of these three characters is really, I think, really on point. He does a really good job of that, and so this is really great writing. This is one of two books I have by James Baldwin. The other is Giovanni's Room, which is kind of a favorite on BookTube. But anyway, this was the first James Baldwin book that I've read all the way through. It's about 220 pages. I really enjoyed it, so I would heartily recommend picking up this book by James Baldwin if you ever get a chance. So those are the three books that I finished reading this week. At night I have been reading Dune, Messiah by Frank Herbert. This is the second book of the Dune series, and it's a much shorter book than the first book in the Dune series that was made into the movies. This book is about 275 pages, it looks like, and I'm about halfway through. I still don't know if I really love Frank Herbert's writing, but I do find the story pretty captivating and pretty drawing. And in this part of the book, if you are familiar with the first Dune book, in this book, Dune, Messiah, Paul Atreides, with the help of the Freemen, have overthrown the emperor, and so Paul is the new emperor, and he has brought the Freemen were working on, in the first volume, they were working on some way to sort of make Arrakis or Dune more where people could actually live, like it wasn't all desert. They were trying to recreate the environment so that there would be water, and so it appears that they have done that, and so Arrakis has been remade or restored to some degree, but along with that, there is Paul's Freemen are running rampant over the universe in a jihad, and sounds like they have killed many millions of people. And at this point in the book, it seems like I don't know if Paul wants to sort of get out of this situation, but he doesn't really know how to restrain his troops, or there's really kind of some. I feel like the book sort of skips over. It doesn't give us a lot of detail about either how plant life and at least some measure of normalcy was environmentally recreated on Arrakis, or what's going on with the jihad. But there is also a plot against Paul on the part of the Bene Gesserit and other characters, and I think that's a pretty interesting part of this book too. So anyway, this is Dune, Messiah by Frank Herbert. Coming up this July with Jane Austen July, the group read is Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. I've never read this book. I am working my way through the Jane Austen library, the Jane Austen published fully published books anyway. I've read Sense and Sensibility earlier this year, and I've just got done listening to Emma and Pride and Prejudice via Audible. And so I am picking up with Mansfield Park. I'm getting a little bit of an early start to it, but I've only read the first couple chapters. Decided to read the actual text instead of using the Audible version, even though I think the narrator is pretty good. And the narrator for Emma and Pride and Prejudice was very good as well, but I think I lost some of the story. And I read Sense and Sensibility, and so I decided that for Mansfield Park, I would read the text rather than listen to it on Audible. So I hope to get a little bit more from the reading that way. Again, this is Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. That is the group read for Jane Austen July, which is hosted by Katie at Books and Things and two other co-hosts. And I'll leave a link to her, Katie's channel down below. So looking forward to this July's reading and looking forward to continuing to progress through the Jane Austen library. And it looks like for my project this year, I hope to complete all six of those books this year. Related to Jane Austen July, one of the supplemental books that Katie had recommended was What Matters in Jane Austen. And now offhand, I don't remember the man's name who wrote the book. I got it on Kindle. It was like $1.99 or $2.99 or something like that. And so I thought it was worth picking up. And so I'm almost halfway through that. And that book has kind of, the subtitle is 20 Puzzles Solved, or 20 Puzzles Addressed, or something like that, in Jane Austen's writings. And so each chapter kind of looks at a particular sort of literary device that Jane Austen employs, or how she approaches certain topics, whether they are the lower classes or the weather, or Jane Austen. One of the things this author says is, one of the things I guess Jane Austen became known for was her dialogue, her creation of dialogue. And one of the little tricky things she does is there are some characters that she does not allow to speak in the novel. Their words are reported. Different characters in the book will say they talked to this person, and they may summarize what the person said, but we never get a quoted statement or quoted words or anything from these different characters. And so I found that pretty fascinating. So learning quite a bit from that. And again, when I get off here, I'll link to that author's book. And again, it's also at Katie's introduction video for Jane Austen July. And let's see, finally, went to a church rummage sale 2 weeks ago, and this was one of the books I picked up, Educated, a memoir by Tara Westover. Pretty familiar with this book, or at least its existence, and had an idea what the book is about, but hadn't bought it, hadn't borrowed it from the library, just hadn't gotten around to picking this book up, and got over to the rummage sale, and it was $1. So I thought, well, definitely worth adding it to my overflowing library. I've read a couple chapters. It's pretty fascinating. This girl, now woman author, grew up in Idaho with her very strict Mormon family, and in the early part of the book, her family lives completely off the grid. No birth certificates, no driver's licenses. The kids don't go to school. The father is, kind of a last days prepper kind of person, and they don't want any dealings with the federal government. And so, this tells her story, and she's narrating it as a child at this point. I think she's like 8 or 10 years old or something when the book starts, and there are several other children in the family. The mother and father of her father, in other words, her paternal grandparents, live like just down the hill from her family, but they're interestingly a little bit more moderate. The grandmother wants the son and his family to kind of be a part of normal society, or at a minimum go to hospitals to have their babies. And Tara's mother becomes a midwife in the community among other people who live very isolated or kind of off the grid lifestyles there in Idaho. And of course there's a lot of religious sub-themes to the book, which given my upbringing I can relate to quite a bit. So anyway, those are the books I have read in full or read in part this week. It was a pretty satisfying reading week for me, and today's been a little frazzled. I took 2 of my cats to the vet to get their vaccines, and these are not cats that like to be handled, so it was a little bit of a dramatic episode, but we're all back home. I think we're all safe and sound. But anyway, it's been an eventful week, and please let me know down in the comments what books you're reading this week, any booktube events you're participating in, what you'd like to read in July. And yeah, that's it. Have a good Friday. Have a good weekend. I'll be back with another video sometime soon. Bye.